I call Kiritapu Allan. Oh, sorry, didn't see you.
Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to provide a contribution this afternoon. And Madam Chair, yesterday I offered a relatively animated contribution because I personally am so concerned about the lack of attention that the previous administration paid to the implications that the absence of the DERA amendments have to the primary industries. Now, before I turn my mind specifically to Part 1, which repeals the provisions for the expirations of Subpart 5 and 5A of Part 2 of the primary legislation, I just want to make a brief note about the fact that my opposition yesterday waxed lyrical about the fact that us having to go through this process of taking this legislation through urgency was in some way us trying to lack transparency. And right now we are in committee stage where there's every opportunity for the opposition to ask questions of our minister, to ask questions of our officials, which are sitting in this House. And, Madam Chair, as I've been sitting here listening to the contributions, or lack thereof, from my opposition counterparts, I've been trying to understand why, when they had the ADERA amendment bill up on the order paper in March of last year, and knowing that the revocation of the dairy industry restructuring subparts 5 and 5A of Part 5 of the Act is applied to South Island Order 2016. Now, that was enacted because Subpart 5 and 5A were triggered by the fact that the South Island had reached its 20% quota as determined in 2001 when the original Act came into being, and the provisions were triggered almost 2 years ago. This order was gazetted by our former Governor-General, Jerry Mataparae, noting that this provision, Subpart 5 and 5A, would cease to apply to the South Island in May of 2018. Now, that's in 3 months' time. That's in 3 months' time, and the opposition, the former government, has the cheek. 2 parts. One, to say that they are a bastion and friend of our dairy industry, but the reality is that they're completely fine to accept uncertainty within this industry, knowing that we are 3 months out from this order coming into effect, which would mean that the TERA provisions would cease to apply to the Southern Island. Now, they know, because they were the government at the time, they know that the Commerce Commission found that, albeit in 2001, when it might have made sense that 20% of the share milk contributions going to independent processors, that might have been sufficient to debunk the competition that Fonterra held. But when the Commerce Commission came out with their findings last year, I can only imagine the sweat and the beads and tears and quiet little cracks and corners around the former Minister of Primary Industries, what he must have been doing at that stage, knowing that a huge stoush was about to be on his hands, because he was going to have to deal with a battle between Fonterra, that of course they want to be the dominant provider. Why wouldn't you? This is commerce and business. Because they wanted to, and then to compete with the interests of their farmers. Now, we saw the submissions from Federated Farmers, and these guys waxed lyrical yesterday about the 105 submissions that they received. Well, there weren't 105 submissions all in approval of their hack provision dairy compromise legislation that they were going to rush through. No, they weren't. They know that. We know that. This piece of legislation has been rushed through under urgency because the former government failed the farmers of the South Island. They failed the farmers of the South Island. They were happy to let this go through.
The Honourable Claire Curran.
Thank you.